before we do get started, I'm in Melbourne in Australia today, and it's important that when we start our meetings that we do reflect on our First Nations people. In Australia, we do acknowledge our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We understand that they have an ongoing connection to the land, sea, sky, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. All our projects are on the places of First People, and we understand that they have an ongoing history story. They have a design language that is something that we should be mindful of when we're working on our projects. So today we will be going through context and case studies with you. My name is Bernadette Fitzgerald. I lead our sustainability and climate change services here at WSP in Australia. We're joined by Matt Raeburn, who is our APAC regional lead for climate change risk and resilience, but specifically in the space, he's climate change disclosure. So he'll be talking a bit about that. And Richard Woods, who is our risk and resilience leader. We are a large multinational and global business at WSP, but specifically today we will be talking a little bit about Australian-based work or some New Zealand-based work. In Australia, we have more than 5,000 people across the country within all of our major cities. We're working on projects from buildings and property, mining, energy, water, basically engineering and science. We're working in those spaces. We also are doing a lot of advisory work with clients in their corporate reporting settings as well. So we bring all of that information that we're learning from different sectors, from different countries together to try and offer exceptional services, and in this case, exceptional services in climate change risk, resilience building and reporting. So without sort of labouring on that, I might hand over to you, Matt, to set some context.
Thanks, Bernadette. Again, I'm Matt Raeburn with WSP, been with WSP for 3 years, and I'm currently speaking to you from beautiful Wellington, New Zealand, also known as Aotearoa. I'm going to start with a bit of context, talking about some recent policy reporting that's happened in Australia. And we're going to focus a bit on supply chains today for obvious reasons. I'll just start with the bad news. This is not news to a lot of people, unless you haven't seen how the market closed today. But we are currently dealing with really our third price shock in about the last 6 years. But we're seeing more and more of these kinds of shocks more often. And I've been thinking about this as a climate change and sustainability consultant because whether it's driven by geopolitical events or climate change, the approach to the rising cost of fuel is essentially the same. You need to understand and assess your risks and opportunities across your value chain and ultimately enhance the resilience of your business model. And we'll talk about how to do that today through transition planning, which is a part of the disclosure requirements for certain entities in Australia and a New South Wales government, but is really a strategic exercise in the guise of a reporting one. I'm phrasing this as a transition that is happening to us. We don't have a choice about being on this journey. It will happen whether we want it to or not, and whether, again, it's driven by geopolitical events, other economic shocks, or climate change, natural hazards, the kinds of things that Richard and I specialize in. When Australia released their most recent national adaptation plan, and together with their first accompanying national climate change risk assessment, supply chains were a focus of that adaptation plan and risk assessment. I'm not going to really speak to what the Australian government, the federal government, has said they're going to do about supply chains, because I think we want to talk more about what this means for individual organizations. But if you do want to see what the government is announcing about their measures to address the resilience of supply chains, please go ahead and look at the climate risk assessment and the adaptation plan if you haven't already. Now, in the climate risk assessment, they did assess the risk ratings for risk to supply chains as being moderate over the current period, which extends through mid-century, high from 2050 on, and very high from 2090 on. And that's just the risk rating of climate change by itself. So that's that's not including things like what's happening now with the Strait of Hormuz or COVID or the Russia-Ukraine war. That's independent of that. So just by itself, if climate change has a moderate impact on supply chains over the next several decades, when you add in the cascading effects of all of these different drivers, you can actually have a risk rating that's much higher than for any individual one driver. And right now, the Australian government, again, just in response to the climate change risk, is not looking at transformational adaptation, but rather at improved management of the risk and incremental adaptation. Again, though, if you're dealing with multiple different drivers, as you always are going to be, then you might want to consider whether or not that response is sufficient in light of those additional drivers. This is from the National Adaptation Plan. They talk about how supply chains currently experience occasional impacts exacerbated by climate change. That is true, but we know that those impacts are going to increase in either frequency or intensity or both, very much dependent on geography, and Richard can speak a bit to that. Also, it's going to have different effects for different sectors. I pulled out a few interesting bits from the primary sectors part of the discussion about supply chains because, and especially coming from New Zealand too, I mean, farming is very, very vulnerable to these kinds of supply shocks. As most of you will know, it's not just oil and natural gas that is being impacted, but things like fertilizer as a result of the war. And the results can be, as you see, wasted food, food shortages, and reduced revenue for those primary producers. There are some interesting hypothetical impacts on supply chains that are included in this real economy technical report from the Australian Climate Service, which I'd encourage you to take a look at. One of them is they looked at a major flooding event based on prior flooding that's happened in Victoria and New South Wales in the last few years. A severe tropical cyclone following the prior path of tropical cyclone Jasper, and looking at and quantifying impacts in Queensland as a result. Also disruption to the east-west supply corridor, which was modeled after the February 2022 flood event that cut access through those highways. Again, I'm not going to go into detail about this. I can answer questions if people have them, but there are some good scenarios there to look at to help understand what those climate-related impacts of climate to supply chains could look like. I'm going to hand it over to Richard now, who's going to speak about climate and natural hazard risk assessments. Richard.
Thanks very much, Matt. Kia ora koutou, everyone. Richard Woods. I lead the subsector for risk and resilience here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and increasingly supporting the WSP Australia team with physical, climate, and natural hazard risk assessment work as well. Thanks for the introduction on supply chains, Matt. And we're living in an age now where we've got a wealth of data and information and technology which we can use to create insights into not only what our risk is today, but how that might change through a changing climate or through dynamic changes such as supply chain issues. And so I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction into how we're using this data and information and the opportunities going forward to underpin things like transition planning with this, and then just give some examples from a project that we did at the national level in New Zealand, and then one specifically for a council, how we can use this to provide insights for future built environments as well, and then hand over to Bernadette, who's going to talk about a specific or an example that we've done in Australia. So if I take a step back and look at a data maturity chain, if we look at the left there, just at the arrow across the bottom, we've got poor data to the left, and then towards the right, we've got really robust data. There's kind of three main types of risk assessment or modelling that we can do to create insights and create an evidence base to inform these types of assessment. And on the left there, we have exposure. So essentially, we have an asset or something that is exposed to that particular hazard, being flooding, bushfire, earthquake, tsunami, volcanic, whichever, and it could be buildings, people, it could be agriculture, it could be anything. If we overlay those two geospatial data sets, we can start to quantify the value of those assets. So the total value there from flooding might be 84 billion, from earthquake it might be 236 billion, and that's what we call contingent liability, and insurance is used to understand what the full liability of an asset portfolio is. We can also use that modelling to actually understand where areas or parts of the portfolio that aren't exposed. So it's a really good tool to allow us to prioritise where we might want to do more robust risk assessment. If we move into the centre of the data maturity chain, we might have more specific information about a particular scenario. So the image there is a Cyclone Gabrielle, which impacted New Zealand in early 2023. And we can actually have observed or forecast understanding of where the flood extents might occur, or where we might experience strong winds. Now, these are what we call deterministic scenarios, or essentially just a representation of one specific event. And that's not to be confused with climate scenarios, which I've got just above there, which are future realizations of what the world might look like under different warming scenarios that many of you will be familiar with. Those climate scenarios can be used in aligned temperature changes to change the intensity of the hazard scenarios that we model, and we can start to understand what those either more frequent or less frequent changes, or more intense or less intense changes will look like over time. And if we want to get into more complex risk modelling, you can start to use statistical models to understand the full range of potential uncertainty. So while we've got Cyclone Gabrielle tracking down the east coast of New Zealand equally, the uncertainty with that event meant it could have been a Category 2 event. It could have tracked down the west coast. It could have tracked right over the top of Auckland, our largest centre. So what we do is we create several GIS layers which show the representation of the hazards associated with that scenario, and then we use statistics to quantify overall what is the whole risk profile that we might see with a cyclone approaching the top of the North Island. And then we can average that out, and we can create average annual losses to price risk over time, which allows us to underpin the risk from our full portfolio through insurance or any other means. Thanks, Matt. But we need pieces of the risk equation to feed into each of those types of risk modelling. And so here we need some information about the hazard, so geospatial representation of that typically. So where is the flood extent going to be, and some information about that, like how deep that flood is in that location. We need some information about the asset. So that might be buildings, pylons, any part of the infrastructure network that we might be building or managing. And then we need some information about the vulnerability of that asset to the hazard. And I like to use the Three Little Pigs as an example here. If you've got a straw hut, a timber hut, and a brick hut, and you've got a 200-kilometre gust of wind, the 200-kilometre gust of wind interacting with that straw hut will completely destroy it. So therefore, we assign a damage ratio of 1, complete damage. And then we can put that alongside a reinstatement cost, and we can quantify how much it's going to cost to reinstate that asset. So if we've got 10 straw huts, we times that by 10. The timber hut may lose its roof, so it's 20% damage, so we assign a damage ratio of 0.2, and the brick hut might remain undamaged. And so for every different type of asset, we have these vulnerability models in the literature that we use and repurpose to quantify the losses associated with those events. And they apply to specific assets. So there's distinguishing vulnerability models for wooden bridges and concrete reinforced bridges compared to other different types of structures. And then if we use those three pieces of the puzzle, we can quantify consequence, which is either represented as reinstatement cost, or we might actually look at different levels of damage, which I'll show you in our examples in a second. Thanks, Matt. So what we've found, just in these examples, the first I'm going to show you an example of what we did for the New Zealand Transport Agency mid last year. This is a big agency, biggest government transport agency in the country, building and monitoring our state highways and a large proportion of our roads. And because it's such a large agency, the literacy around exposure modelling and risk modelling and how it can be used in the day-to-day decision-making of people within the agency is quite I would say immature or quite limited. It is variable, but we've got people that are either asset managers, planners, we've got people trying to do national budgets, we've got operations people on the ground trying to do forecasting, and they're all trying to use this information. So we did a piece of work to go, okay, well, across all of the natural hazard exposure, climate exposure, scenarios and probabilistic assessment, how can that be used in the agency? And so we provided some insights. Here's just an example of looking at one particular case study region, or sorry, 3 case study regions, Gisborne, Taranaki and Marlborough, and looking at it from a natural hazard exposure perspective. And you can see here the distribution of, or how many millions of dollars of corridor state highway network are exposed to different hazards. And you can see that Gisborne has the greatest exposure overall, which the large component of that exposure is with flooding. So that might be something that they may want to invest in over and above looking at models for coastal inundation, for example, where it's quite limited, compared to Taranaki, which has very little exposure compared to Gisborne, and then Marlborough has a bit higher. So using that exposure modelling across the country, you can start to get a picture of where these hazards, or what proportion of your portfolio or asset base is exposed to each of those hazards. Thanks, Matt. Secondly, we can look at that from a climate variable perspective. And in New Zealand, we have recently downscaled CIMIP 6 data. So that is, how are the extremes for rainfall, wind, and temperature going to change through to 2100 or 2090. These exist across Australia, either downscaled CIMIP 6 or CIMIP 5, but essentially the graph is showing us here for this particular location. At the moment, we have that purple corridor has 20 days that exceed 25 degrees per year, and on average by 2099 we might see an increase for 90 days. So then we talk to the client, well, what impact is that going to have for particular assets and particular renewals and maintenance? For example, tar seal pavements across the state highway network, what does that mean for degradation of increased exposure to hot days, and therefore the need to replace those? And then they can budget that into national budgets to increase renewals and maintenance costs over time. We use climate exposure data a little bit differently. Thanks, Matt. We then did a scenario. I've talked about Cyclone Gabrielle, and we took the actual modelled flood extents provided by Earth Science New Zealand, so the equivalent of Geosciences Australia, and BOM, and quantified the reinstatement costs across different flood hazard levels impacting the Gisborne area. And then we used that information to do a calibration on the actual costs to the agency. And what we found is the modelling showed about a third of the costs that actually occurred during that event, and that's because how the agency are recording the costs from those events is combined into a range of other costs like project costs and labour, which aren't considered in this limited level of physical reinstatement asset modelling. So there's further work there to actually start to expand the modelling and understand the true life of cost of these events for the agency, which was a good lesson. But here's a solid evidence base as a starting point for the physical reinstatement of the asset. Thanks, Matt. And the last area that we did for NZTA was looking at probabilistic losses. So what are all the potential flood hazard events that might impact Taranaki, from the really frequent ones on the left right up to the rare ones, the 1,000-year events on the right. And from that, we can quantify using a Monte Carlo analysis that the average loss that the agency will expect every year is 1.43 million. And so that allows us to price the risk overall. Typically, most often used for insurance purposes, but really good if you've got like a national portfolio. You can quantify average annual loss for all of the different hazards, and then you've got a comparative baseline to say, okay, well, actually, our flood hazard is 1.43 million. Our seismic risk is 500,000. Therefore, we should be prioritising the hazard that has or looking at adaptation and more resilient options for those hazards which might be more frequent or pose a higher cost to your portfolio. So that's what we've done for NZTA, and that's really kind of a 101 in terms of how, or the types of information that can be used. And that report then goes into looking at the specific functions, whether they're asset managers, operations, investment budgeters, finance people, how they can actually use the insights to inform each of their functions within the council to improve their decision making and get more resilient options. I'd say we're still in the early stages of operationalising this work, and we've got a paper going to the NZTA executive leadership team in April to continue this work with the agency. Stepping down to a more local level, I thought it might be good to provide an insight in terms of how this modelling can be used to not only understand risk now, which is essentially what I've just talked about, but also what does that look like from a future risk? So this is looking at one particular example for debris flows. There's a catchment on the left there and an urbanised part of Queenstown and the beautiful South Island there. If you look at the top right, you can see the catchment's very steep, currently forested. If we were to lose that forestation or there was landslides in the upper catchment, we would have debris flows impacting the residential property and commercial property down below on what we call an alluvial fan. And you can see those rocks there. And there's a little blue book there. There's 4-metre rocks sitting at the top of this fan that have been used for landscaping in people's houses. Those rocks didn't get there by design for landscaping. They've been moved from the upper catchment down there. So there will be debris flows through this location, and it's quite challenging for the local council to understand how they would mitigate that risk. So we created an evidence-based, thanks Matt, next slide, just to show you what those debris flows look like. That's what it'll look like. The central issue there, a central photo is from a place called Matata in the North Island of New Zealand from 2005. And similarly on the left, impacting residential property. There are several properties you can't see that were completely obliterated in that event as well. So that's the type of hazard that will be going through that location in future. Thanks, Matt. Pretty scary for the people that are living there. But our job was to model what that might look like in 100 years' time if we were to take the data that we know about the hazard. So on the left, we've got information about the hazard. That's a large event. You probably can't see the key, but if you've got oranges, that's kind of 10 metres depth of debris flow, and then it decreases in size as it pans out across the fan. On the right side, we've got information about the asset. There's some commercial buildings in there, but mostly residential buildings. And then we've got information about those buildings, whether they're 1-storey, 2-storey, timber framed, concrete reinforced structures or other. Next, Matt. And using those two pieces of data with the vulnerability models, we can then quantify either loss on the right-hand side. So you can see that there's one building there that is greater than $10 million to reinstate that building after this event, that's on the left-hand side, or damage state on the right-hand side. So all of those red buildings are completely destroyed from this event. The orange buildings have severe damage, moderate damage for the yellow ones, lighter and insignificant for the green. So we're starting to piece up evidence base to inform, okay, well, this is the state of damage we might see from some of these events. Next one, Matt. And so what we can do to understand future policy options is what the council did in this instance. We have a baseline data set. So that top left shows the building stock as of 2020. We then worked with land use planners to change the GIS layer to represent, well, what if we had no policy in place and allowed uncontrolled development right across that location? Don't get fixated on what the geospatial polygons actually look like, but the key point here is that you've maximized the area that could be developed, and each of those polygons with the fields along the left there provide a representation of that policy. So over 100 years, what will those buildings potentially look like with uncontrolled? We then, on the bottom left, had a policy that had allowed managed intensification. So you'll see upper parts of the fan, those buildings remain the same, but on areas where the hazard is lower, you'll see that some of the polygons have changed to be more intense, to be greater. And then on the bottom right, you'll see a policy for reduction. So that's actually managed retreat or buyback of the properties in the higher risk part of the fan, and then not allowing intensification in the moderate risk part of the fan. So we create these geospatial representations of the future built environment with expert input. Thanks, Matt. And then using that, we can then put that through our model again, using that one hazard data set, and in this case we can see the distribution across each of those 4 policy options of damaged state, so that's colour of the buildings, and then in the lower left of each of those figures you'll see the costs associated with that. So 2020, if that event was to happen, there'd be $39.2 million in losses. By 2100, if we had uncontrolled development, those losses would be greater than 3 times the 2020 baseline. If we look at manage, it's it's just under double the cost, and then reducing those properties, it decreases the cost of that event by 2120. Now, what this doesn't take into consideration is the cost of implementing each of those policies, which is the next piece of work that you take this information and use to inform your cost-benefit analysis. Thanks, Matt. And then we just get across a range. So down the right-hand side, we've got a range of different sizes of events. So from small, moderate, and large, and you can just get a whole lot of statistics across each of those frequencies of those events and across the different policies to get a strong evidence base to inform decision making. And then you can graph that up like the next slide, Matt. To look at for a very large event, we can see that if we have on the 2020s, the blue bar, if we allow the uncontrolled development, you're increasing your losses by $93 million. Similarly, for managed retreat, you're still increasing your losses, and the only one you're reducing your losses there if you have reduced or managed retreat, essentially, again, not considering the cost of purchasing those properties back. But I guess the point with this one is to kind of demonstrate for the range of different hazard events that you've got, we can actually not only look at the risk today, but we can change what that portfolio looks like. And that doesn't need to be the residential portfolio. It could be a future asset base, a national asset base, or it could be, if you're a hotel operator, the portfolio of hotels that you have across either Australia or New Zealand, or future areas which you're looking to expand that portfolio to, and we can assess the risk to those sites as well. Thanks, Matt. And then finally, I just wanted to finish on WSP, as Bernadette described earlier, is a global business, and we are looking at how we can support the New Zealand government as a whole. So we're actually utilising our Global Capability Centre in India to pre-train geotechnical engineers in processing natural hazard claims. The Canterbury earthquake sequence in New Zealand, and it took over 5 years to process residential claims, which has a significant social bearing on people, and we want to leverage where we can and help the New Zealand government to bring down that 5-year time frame by having people ready to go for surge capacity when the next major event impacts New Zealand, whether that be an earthquake, a volcano, or a tsunami. And I'll hand over to Bernadette now just to cover off a few slides on how we've used this in Australia, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, Richard. I just wanted to reflect on what you've presented there. I think one of the things we find when we're working with clients on trying to understand what they can do about climate risk exposure is they don't know where to start. And I think what Richard's been able to show there are some different contexts around trying to understand your risks and how you might start to then use that as part of a decision-making process. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project we've been working on, but I think it's reasonably representative of a situation we're seeing across our projects. Is with clients where, or projects where we have a client who has done some work around climate risk considerations that may be at a physical risk level at an asset and at a organisational level, but trying to then pull that together into an overall understanding of where they're at and then to think about what their next steps might be. So the example I'm going to talk to you about today is with a health provider. This is one where they have a large portfolio of hospitals and medical centres that they are providing across a reasonably large geographic area in Australia. When we got given this brief for this project, the intent of this from the client is they wanted a roadmap. What do they need to do? What does that look like for them over the next 5 years? How do they prioritise what to do next? So when you're involved in a project where you have a very huge number of things going on, all of them are critical to both the client but also to the community, we had to think about a project design where we were able to look at broadly at an organisational level what was going on, but also to consider that at a representative site level. So we ended up coming up with a project plan that did consider organisational risk management, climate change risk exposure processes and safety management processes that may already exist at an organisational level. And then we used a set of pilot or prototype type sites to understand and use that to test against and make sure that we understood the organisation not just centrally, but how that might actually work out in an actual live setting. A really good example of so hospitals, we certainly looked at different hospitals in regional settings, in urban settings, to understand new hospitals, older hospitals as well, to see how they would be performing, if there were some obvious similarities to each other and differences around their risk exposure and vulnerability exposure. Also trying to understand their socioeconomic setting as well and how that may change how the risk was actually realised within the community. And then also to look at the other assets that might exist within that broader organisation. And so one of the key things for this particular health provider was a distribution facility. And I think during COVID, we certainly had a dawning moment when we realised how important supply chain risk was on the functioning of our health services. In this particular case, they had a distribution facility that was a very central node for the broader health service. That facility provides consumables, medical consumables, and also some medication to the broader health service. What we did is actually then, as part of our pilot sites, is actually look at what the exposure was of that particular facility, what they might already be doing to manage climate change risk or weather risk as well, because I think we're talking about both here now, and then to start to contemplate what those exposure risks would be moving forward. It was really good to understand the things that they did really well at the distribution centre, so the things that they had planned for. And COVID was actually a really great learning point for them. They had learned a lot about how their supply chain might react and things they should be doing there. But I don't think there'd probably been the same extent of understanding not just the risk of flooding or heat exposure at this particular site, but what would happen as well if they had network flooding and impacts around road flooding, where their suppliers were into their facility, how they would actually be impacted in coming into the facility and getting consumables into the distribution facility and then out. So it was quite an interesting context that we work through with our client, and we learn a lot about where the client systems were delivering quite well, a good understanding and were ready, and probably where they weren't. So context does matter, and being really thoughtful about where the impacts might be in your organisation are really important as well. And if you want to go to the next slide in terms of then what we were able to come out with. So at an organisational level, we ended up breaking this up into what would be something that would make sense for sort of the broader health organisation to work through over the next, and we're talking short term here, so the next sort of 5 years, what was reasonable to deliver. And then what order they should prioritise those things in. So at an organisational level, and one of the things we found, and we're seeing quite consistently, is having a common view on what risk is, who the key stakeholders who should be involved in those processes, and really just trying to get a collective understanding at an organisational level of how risk and projections and the data sets all should be coming together. It's a simple thing to do, but it's a really, really important first step we're seeing. And then from there, we can start to see what sort of centrally can the organisation be doing around setting out controls, understanding responsibilities within the organisation, developing guidance that can actually be sent out to more broadly to to health providers that they were working with. And then probably thinking beyond that, what would need to happen to make sure that information was consistently working, being checked on, and being updated to make sure it was reflecting the maturity of the organisation as they progress through their understanding. The next thing was really trying to understand what that might look like at a health service level, or actually at a hospital, for example. Then this is actually trying to think more generally at what you again would need to do at a provider level. So really trying to understand is how are you managing your asset registers? Do you have bush management? A lot of these health hospitals are actually located in regional areas, high exposure to bushfire and flooding as well in many cases. So just making sure that there was really plans in place for all of those scenarios. And then thinking about what the capital works or OPEX programs might be, and when they should start to plan to include those in their guidelines and standards, and changing things in that way. And then I guess moving on again into when we might actually be in a position to do a little bit more around understanding how we actually update documentation and how we actually work through with their supply chain dependencies in a bit more detail with them. Understanding, budgets are what they are, and it would be great if we could have an infinite budget, but having some really clear views on what you would do and the priority or order over a 5-year time frame is a really good way to get started and help plan out where those budgets may be best spent and when. So I think that's probably might be enough, Matt, but I'm not sure if there's anything else you want to reflect on this particular example.
Just that it really does show that no matter where you are in your maturity for dealing with these kinds of issues, there's already stuff that you are going to be doing as an organization that will be useful for your improving your resilience or for decarbonizing, whatever the strategic shift is. You're not actually starting from a standing start. There's a lot that's already going on that can be repurposed and incorporated. So we're building on, as this organization did, building on what they're already doing well, and then trying to supplement that and identify what they're not doing that they need to do going forward. I mean, even with very cash-strapped, resource-constrained organizations, there's obviously a lot of challenges there, but there's always something that can be done with even those constraints. I was fortunate enough to have a hand in developing the disclosure requirements in New Zealand. With the Ministry for the Environment, we were one of really the first country to actually require it across most of our economy. And it's great to see Australia now starting to release their first set of mandatory climate disclosures. And we're working with a number of those Group 1 agencies or organizations rather to do that. But it covers the same areas that those of you who know disclosures in any country will be familiar with. Governance, how you're actually connecting the decision-making on climate-related risks and opportunities with your boards and your executives. Strategy, of which transition planning is a part. I'll get to that in a second. How you're managing your risks, and then how you're measuring your progress against targets that you've set, including with greenhouse gas emissions. This is also a structure that is adapted by the New South Wales government. We have just been advising them on the development of a transition planning framework because all organizations in New South Wales that meet certain criteria identified by the New South Wales Treasury do have to prepare their own climate disclosures, which are being phased in similar to the disclosure regime for private sector. So it's great to see the public sector, at least in New South Wales, following suit, because it really is a good way of a good process for any organization, private sector or public sector. But I'm just going to focus on transition planning for right now. So for those of you who don't know, transition planning is the aspect of your entity's overall strategy, laying out your targets, actions, or resources for the transition to a lower carbon economy, including actions such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And it really is part of your overall strategy and tries to bring together the multitude of things that you are already doing or need to be doing and haven't been. So that transition planning piece is part of your strategy that is a bit more longer term focused, even though you are looking at it over the short and medium terms as well. And under the disclosure regime, you get to define what those time horizons are. But the transition plan is designed to get you there through actions over the short and medium term towards long-term outcomes. And one of the things that we also work on with clients is how you actually implement this, because the transition planning piece is strategy. The transition planning work program, as we call it, is the implementation piece. And one of the things that I like about working at WSP, having worked at a number of different professional services firms over the course of my career, is that I am not an engineer, I'm not a planner, I'm not a scientist, but I have access to all of those people, colleagues like Richard and Bernadette, who can help to advise our clients on strategy that's actually going to be practical and implementable and can go all the way down to the operational level. And then that work program is designed to feed in learnings into the transition planning piece. So it's a cyclical process of continuous improvement when done well. We've adapted the DAP approach to visualizing some of the options. So for those of you who don't know, DAP stands for Dynamic Adaptive Policy Pathways. It was a method created in the Netherlands, mostly to deal with adaptation to climate change. But these little metro maps, I think, are really helpful for simplifying and identifying that under different scenarios, and depending on what is a priority for you now or later, referring back to those examples that Bernadette was using for that state agency. If you identify the information that you need to monitor in order to make decisions, then you'll also understand when those decision points actually are and how to actually know if you've hit a certain threshold. And in the conventional context, and the reason that this was developed in the very flood-prone Netherlands, it can be things like how much sea level rise has actually occurred, and once you hit that level, that threshold, then you're at a decision-making point. The same approach can be true whether we're talking about insurance premiums or major disruption of deliveries of supplies, materials for a certain amount of time. I mean, these are somewhat, I guess, judgment calls in terms of what quantifies as a sufficient threshold, but it does give you at least a plan for identifying when you get to those thresholds, whether it's appropriate for you to, take a decision about some actions that you've already identified from options that are available to you. And that's really one of the benefits of doing this is you're not going to be then having to figure out what to do in the middle of a crisis, because you'll actually have a plan that gives you options and that you can adapt to the specific circumstances of that crisis. So I'm just going to go through step by step with a bit more detail about what the transition planning process looks like, because I think it's, again, a really useful process, whether you're dealing with changes to your strategy as a result of climate change or for other reasons. But it starts with looking at the assumptions that underlie your business model. And that's regardless of whether they're directly or indirectly implicated by climate change, because climate change, as we've mentioned, is one of those threat multipliers, often works in conjunction with other drivers to have these cascading impacts. And then consider how those assumptions might be challenged under several plausible future climate scenarios. You're only required to look at 2 climate scenarios under the Australian reporting requirements. Generally 3 or 4 is, I think, a better approach. Most people use 3. But then you start to understand whether or not those assumptions hold under those different plausible scenarios. It's also really important to identify your strategic intent. So you are going to want to ask yourself, like, whether or not those changing foundational assumptions necessitate shifts in your strategy across those different plausible climate scenarios. Do those assumptions change differently across each scenario? And what changing assumptions challenge your ability to continue operating? What this is all getting at is what kind of organization do you want to be? If you are facilitating transports, are you, in the case of a New Zealand transport agency like primarily focused on roads, or are there other types of transport that you want to focus on as well? Is the strategic intent about building roads, or is it about being able to transport people? Getting back to that and understanding then what you can actually do across those different scenarios. And then you can look at those strategic options in the long-term value proposition that you offer by identifying those strategic options to enhance your business model's resilience, reassessing your long-term value proposition, and ranking preferred strategic options across a value and cost matrix. Not just looking at the quick wins, although those can be very important, but also what those longer-term options can be. And it's really important for those actions to be tangible too. It's all well and good to say you're investigating or you're considering, but we're looking for actions and processes that are potentially already in place to manage your risks and opportunities, or that you could perform to contribute to enhance your resilience. And it's also really important to understand when you would implement those actions over the short, medium, or long-term time horizons, barriers to implementing those actions, and also information and data gaps that might prevent you from identifying actions or implementing those actions. We call these in the technical context signals and triggers, but going back to the graphic before, it's really just information and decision points. What information can be used to monitor and inform your actions? And you're looking at trends there, again, mentioning that we've had these multiple price shocks over the last 6 years. And then you get to these decision points, these triggers, where you initiate a process to change a pathway before a harmful threshold is reached. And lastly, and most importantly, it's how are you going to resource and what is the funding? And I think it's important to look at this honestly in the first instance about what you would actually need before kind of constraining it within what you actually have, so that you're not going into it just with the understanding of this is what we can do. And so we're just going to think about a risk in terms of what we can do, but actually understanding the unmitigated risk and understanding what would be necessary to actually fund management of it, even if you don't fully have that. That transparency, especially internally, is really important. You don't want to be deluding yourself about whether or not you're able to do it with the funding that you have. All right, so a few more considerations about transition planning for the value chain. It's really important to remember that you cannot reduce your greenhouse gas emissions without partnering across your value chain. Everybody's Scope 3 emissions include somebody else's Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So for transition planning to actually work, it does need to be done cooperatively, and really think about the influence you have through your value chain to encourage partners there. Sometimes it's providing information, sometimes it's procurement provisions, but there are ways to influence your value chain, I'm sure, to be able to help to give you the outcomes that you need as part of your transition plan to meet your targets. And also consider how you can improve your resilience through the vulnerable points in your supply chain. You know, it's not enough to just look at the sites that are directly under your control. If you are a primary, like an extractive industry, and you use certain kind of ports of landing and ports of loading, understanding like the vulnerabilities to those ports would be something that you should consider as part of your assessment of risks and opportunities. And again, considering the value of different options that you have, is localization sometimes a good option, further diversification, stockpiling. You know, there's different avenues open to you, and it's about finding the balance of the right ones. I'm just going to touch on quickly before we go into questions, an example of diversifying customers and products. And I'm going to use a typical example because it's in the insurance sector. You know, insurance is available for certain kinds of needs, like homeowners insurance and vehicle insurance, continuity of business insurance. But you know, what we've been helping clients to work with, in this case, we were fortunate enough to work with IAG's New Zealand entity, was how they can meet customers' needs in response to climate change by looking at their own plausible climate scenarios. And what IAG identified was that they can take some actions within the short term to pursue underwriting green technology businesses, such as commercial solar. So they're becoming part of actually incentivizing that transition, that is important to them being able to achieve their outcomes for transition planning. And on a longer term, being able to uplift their own capability to underwrite emerging green sectors and assets to help build resilience. So it's not just about the more primary sector industries or conventional industries. Banks, insurers, the financial sector also needs to be considering ways to diversify their customers' products, supply chains, et cetera. All right, Richard, a couple of takeaways from you first.
Yeah, so I guess in summary of what we're discussing, hopefully just to take away that risk modelling, it can often seem quite expensive and complex, but start simple with exposure modelling, and that can really help you to target areas for robust risk assessment and also provide a strong evidence base to inform future investment and more robust risk assessment. And using hazard data and risk modelling can provide that robust evidence base for decision making and informed transition planning. It's something that we're continuing to grow with clients more and more. Thanks, Matt.
And I'll just add again, emphasizing that this transition, whether it's driven by climate change or something else, it's inevitable. It is happening to us. But the transition planning exercise is a strategic one that just happens to be in the guise of a disclosure requirement. So you can use it to enhance the resilience of your business model overall, not just for climate change. And enhancing your resilience to climate change will enhance your resilience to other drivers of economic disruption. We have a few minutes for questions. Thanks.
We have very, very sort of tight time frame now. I'll go to the first one that came in on the Q&A, which was from Zoe, and I'm not sure if you can see that, Matt, but she's asked about where organisations quantify different physical hazards. How are they determining whether certain risks should remain part of their detailed disclosure versus being acknowledged at a higher level? Interesting.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, hopefully this is not too easy of an answer, but it comes down to whether or not it's material enough that you need to. The level of detail is dictated by materiality. Ultimately, you only need to disclose what is material in order for people to understand whether it's material or not. And I do often recommend to clients that they disclose where they have done the work to identify that a risk is not material, because if you're a user of these disclosures, you may be expecting to see something based on your own assumptions about a company or a sector. And if you don't see it, you might wonder why it's there. So sometimes it can be better to front foot that. But yeah, it really just comes down to, do you have enough detail in there for the primary user, which is usually an investor, or in the case of government agencies, is going to be the people, their own customers or their employees, other stakeholders. But have you provided enough information for them to understand why it is material to you as an organization, and as a result needs to be addressed as part of your transition planning?
And then Matt, probably then jumping to the next question, which I think is somewhat related, which is just around recent commentary has stated that the outputs of the climate risk disclosures were weak, they're not quantified, and they're basically narrative. Do we have any thoughts on this, and what benefits or levers do you think that the risk disclosure processes actually enable?
Yeah, I mean, getting to work on the with boards, execs, people on the ground who have to implement these actions in practice, like the process itself is where you get the value from. Like at the end of the day, my aspiration is not to be somebody who produces the best climate disclosures as reports. I want to go through the process with clients to help them to be able to make better decisions and to understand what they're dealing with, so that they can make those decisions. And that is not being, I think, reflected well enough in disclosures, was not reflected well enough in disclosures, I think, in New Zealand. There's a lot of risk aversion, which is totally understandable, but I think that will balance out over time, and you will see organizations more comfortable talking about what they are doing in their public-facing documents, as well as internally. But yeah, don't if you are not always inspired by the climate disclosure that you're looking at, do not let that fool you. There's usually quite a bit of additional work that goes on behind the scenes. As I know, like for the transition plans we've done, we go work stream by work stream and sub work streams with a lot of different detail. Very little of that actually makes it into the report, but that's not what it's for. It's for helping the organization to actually implement their transition plan. So, but again, I think that's kind of divide between what's publicly reported and what's internal will narrow over time. Just give it time.
All right. I think we're just on time now. So apologies, a couple of questions we didn't get to, but we'll maybe respond background.
Sure.
So thanks all for your time. There was a question around, will we be sharing the slides, Matt? I'm not sure. That's one we'll take away. Yes, there we go. The answer is yes.
Happy to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Richard and I are now going to scramble and pull out all our content. No, that sounds that sounds great, Matt. So thank you all for your time today. Let you get back on with your day, but I hope you found this informative. We found it very informative putting together, and great to see so much interest. Thank you.